Thank you.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. How many of you were here last week? Oh, good. I didn't scare you away. That's really great. And I welcome those of you that weren't here last week. So I'm really appreciative of being here again. I just really enjoyed our time together last week, and I hope it'll be just as enjoyable this week. So I thought I would start by telling you why do I teach this stuff, or what's my credentials for teaching this stuff? So I thought I should go back to the basics and tell you that I co-wrote a children's book about world religion. So what you're getting is kind of the children's version of all this. Just kidding. But this was really actually something that was really helpful to do as a professor, because if you can't explain it to children, you can't explain it to anybody. So this was really a wonderfully fun project to do about 2 years ago, able to do this with a colleague. We wrote this book together. It was published by Beaming Books, which is a imprint of Fortress Press, so what used to be Augsburg Fortress. So it's a great children's book publisher. So anyway, so those are my credentials. I didn't tell you that last week. I was like, I better tell my credentials this week. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today. Oh, I got to go the other way. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to tell you a little about next week too. So in terms of trying to help you understand world religions and give you this kind of what I think is an appreciative knowledge, I think it's very hard in a short session like this to go through all the basics of any religion. So what I've decided to do is focus on themes within these different religions that I find particularly helpful to me in my own understanding of my own faith and how they add to my own faith commitment as a Christian. So that's kind of the take I'm taking on this. I'm not going to give you all the facts of each religion. That would be just kind of laying everything out. You can read that in a book, or you can read it in an adult book as well, just all those different things. And I promised you the last week that I'll give you a book list, where I'll give you a bibliography of places you might want to go if you want more information. So what I'm going to do is, again, talk about these things that have really enriched my particular faith because I've studied these religions and met people from these religions. So if you remember, I just love this cartoon, so I had to put it in there. It's kind of, as my kids would say, this is a dad joke, okay? It says, we'd like to talk to you about cheeses. It's church mice who are doing this here. So anyway, so I think it's often, we have to think about, have you ever had to correct someone's misconceptions about your religion? So have you ever had that experience of having to say, no, that's not, you might think that that's what I believe because I am a Lutheran, but that's not really what we believe as Lutherans. Or you might think we practice in this way, but that's not really what we do. I think it's important to have accurate information about people's religions and let people themselves tell you what that is, okay? So if you remember from last week, this is what we talked about last week. We talked about these three things in terms of interfaith cooperation: relationships, knowledge, and attitudes, and how they kind of uphold each other together and they contribute to kind of creating interfaith cooperation and understanding. So what I'm going to do today is just focus on two religions. I'm going to focus on Judaism and Islam. Next week, I'm going to focus on Eastern religions. I'm going to focus on Hinduism and Buddhism. But for this week, I'm going to focus on Judaism and Islam. So let's start by talking a little bit about Judaism, okay? So I'm going to, again, talk about some themes that I find particularly helpful in Judaism in terms of enriching my own faith. So here's the first thing I'd like to say. Chutzpah. You guys all heard that word before? Chutzpah. So chutzpah means audacity or boldness. But in the context of Jewish religious practice, it's considered the idea that you can challenge both God and others to be just and to do good, okay? And there's so many examples in the Hebrew scriptures where this is exactly what the great kind of faith leaders of the Hebrew scriptures are doing. So the first story I thought of was in Genesis 18, and it's where Abraham is challenging God not to destroy the city of Sodom. I don't know if you remember this story, where he first says, if I find 50 righteous people, will you destroy it? And God says, no, not for 50. And then he says 45, and he says, not for 45. 40. He goes all the way down, trying to, get it down to the lowest number he could possibly have so the city's not destroyed. He's kind of bargaining with God. He's challenging God in this way because he has this very close relationship with God. So this idea of chutzpah implies a close and intimate relationship with God. The next one is the definition of Israel. So Israel is one who wrestles with God. And this is in Genesis 32, where Jacob is renamed Israel because he has this experience where he wrestles with this angel, and then he finds out actually later that it was actually God he was wrestling with, okay? And Jewish folks say that that's our job. Our job is to wrestle with God, to kind of have this give and take relationship with God. And finally, the prophets are filled with stories of prophets who both challenge God, but also challenge their communities, okay? And one of my favorite passages is from Isaiah 58. Isaiah 58 talks about the idea of what kind of fast do I want? I don't want you to put sackcloth and ashes on, which was what they used to do in the old days. You'd put on a burlap dress. You would cover your head with ashes in order to show that you were fasting. I don't want that, God says, or Isaiah says in the name of God. What I want is I want you to at least loose the chains of oppression, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, liberate captives. Okay, this is a really different take. It's saying, I want to challenge you to do good. I want to challenge you to do good and to be just. Okay, so I think this is a really important concept that has really enriched my faith, and I'll talk a little bit more at the end about how each of these things has enriched me. The second thing I want to talk about is another piece of learning from Judaism that besides the Hebrew Scriptures, there's something called the Talmud. And the Talmud is the book of Jewish law. Okay, one author says it's a library of Jewish law, lore, custom, and superstition. And there's several different sections of the Talmud. How the Talmud is organized with a particular passage right in the middle that is from the Torah. Okay, from the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. And then what happened is, over time, different people added their commentary to this. So the Mishnah is the first level of commentary. The next one was the Gemara, the next level. And then finally, there's more commentaries at the end. So the different colors here represent different Jewish scholars who are commenting from different centuries even on this one text. The very interesting thing about the Talmud is that often the scholars disagree. Okay, one scholar will say, the text means this, and the other scholar will say, no, it doesn't mean that at all, it means this. It's a book of disagreement, and it's considered very valuable to have this disagreement, that we shouldn't have to agree, because sometimes in disagreement, we truly come to the truth. Sometimes when we have competing truths, we come to some larger truth. So I think that's just another really interesting thing that I can take away from Judaism as well. And then the next thing is to heal and repair the world by liberating the divine sparks in all things. This is tikkun olam is the term used for this. And it actually is very interesting. The idea of tikkun olam doesn't come, the concept of tikkun olam, to healing and repairing the world, is throughout Hebrew Scriptures, but the actual idea of healing and repairing the world comes from a legend that's found in the Kabbalah, which is a work of Jewish mysticism. It was by this Spanish mystic named Isaac Laria, and the idea was that when God created the world, created the universe, God sent these glass shards into the universe, okay? And they exploded into the universe, and the human's role in the world is to collect those shards that God has put out there to kind of put the world back together again. So God kind of had to diffuse all of that out into the world to create it, but now the human's role is to bring all that back together. So this is healing and repairing the world. You have to find ways of healing and repairing the world, okay? So I find that a really beautiful concept, that that's our role as human beings, is to heal and repair the world. And then going along with that, this is a great quote. There's a famous rabbi, Rabbi Hillel. Maybe you've heard of the Hillel student organizations, which are on college campuses for Jewish students. They're named after this famous Rabbi Hillel. And Rabbi Hillel, a non-Jew, asked Rabbi Hillel to teach him all about the Torah while standing on one foot. And Rabbi Hillel said, "What is hateful to you, don't do unto your neighbor. The rest is commentary. Now go and study." So he's saying, if you don't got that right, you've missed the whole point. Okay, you've missed the whole point of religion if you haven't gotten that right. If you're not able to do what is right by your neighbor. Okay, so another concept that goes along to me with that healing and repairing the world, how you treat your neighbor. And then the last piece that I want to talk about related to Judaism that I think is really important is the idea of theodicy. Okay, so theodicy comes from the Greek words theo, which means God, and dike, which means justification. And literally it means the justification of God. That sounds kind of funny, but what it does is ask this question: where is God amid suffering and evil? This is a perennial question of human existence, a perennial question for all religions, right? All religions have this idea, how do we think about where God is in suffering and evil? And, Jewish folks, in light of the Holocaust, had to answer this question in a very different way than many religions had to. They had to answer it as a community. All of us asked that question perhaps individually, but they really had to answer it as an entire community. It really shaped the modern Jewish understanding of themselves, okay? And this comes from, this quote I have here comes from Elie Wiesel. You know who Elie Wiesel is? Famous Nobel Prize-winning author, wrote the book Night, which was about his experiences as a young person in a work camp during World War II, during the Holocaust. So this is from his memoir. His memoir is called All Rivers Lead to the Sea. And this is a specific section in his memoir. He writes about his life in his memoir, but then he has this really interesting section in the middle of his memoir where it's like a little kind of essay about what does he think about answering this question, where is God amid suffering and evil? Okay, and this is what he says. A midrash recounts. A midrash is like a kind of a re-commentary on some story. Okay, a midrash recounts. When God sees the suffering of his children scattered among the nations, he sheds 2 tears in the ocean. When they fall, they make a noise so loud it is heard around the world. It is a legend I enjoy rereading, and I tell myself, perhaps God shed more than 2 tears during his children's recent tragedy, but men, cowards that they are, refuse to hear them. Is that at last an answer? No, it's a question. Yet another question. So if you were my class, I'd say, okay, what's he saying? Where is God amid suffering and evil? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Or are you going to be like my students and all look silent? It's sad.
Sad himself.
He's sad himself. Oh, thank you. And God is sad himself, right. So God is sad himself about suffering, but God is saying, who's the one who's responsible for the suffering? Humans are, right? Humans are responsible. Humans are the ones who turn a blind eye to other people's suffering. So he's saying, don't blame God, blame the people who don't pay attention to God, kind of imploring them to do right by other people. Okay, so I think that's a really beautiful way to think about our responsibility when there's so much suffering in the world, that we have a responsibility, and as opposed to spending our time blaming God, we should spend our time working for kind of the suffering of others, working against the suffering of others. Okay. So here's my takes then on how Judaism enriches my faith. First of all, I think this whole idea of chutzpah is really an idea about having intimacy with God. If you have an intimate relationship with a spouse, a friend, a brother, a sister, you can argue with that person and still feel like you have that relationship, right? So Judaism has this idea that we have this intimacy with God, so intimate that it's a give and take relationship with God. We can say what we really think to God. We can have that kind of intimacy. And it also talks about intimacy with one another then. Because we have this intimacy with God, we share this intimacy with one another. And actually, I brought something, and I should have passed this out ahead of time. Let me put this down. I don't think I have enough, so I'm going to give a couple to each table.
That's fine, Chris.
And you can share, but this is a...
Let me do it.
Oh,
You
thank
have enough.
Okay, so this is a poem by a Jewish rabbi, but I think I have a couple more here. I'll wait till everyone gets one. Okay, so hopefully everyone can at least look on with someone, share with a partner about this. So this is called Between by Harold Schulweis. And it says, God is not in me, nor is God in you, but between us. God is not me or mine, nor you or yours, but ours. God is known not alone, but in relationships, not as a separate, lonely power, but through our kinship, our friendship, through our healing and binding and raising up of each other. To know God is to know others. To love God is to love others. To hear God is to hear others. More than meditation, more than insight, more than feeling, between us are claims, obligations, commandments, to act, to do, to behave, our beliefs. I seek God not as if God were alone, an isolated person, he or she, a process, a power, a being, a thing. I seek God not as if I were alone, a thinker, a mediator, a discrete entity. I seek God in connection, in the nexus of community. I pray and celebrate the betweenness which binds and holds us together. And even when I am left alone, I am sustained by my memory of our betweenness and the promise of our betweenness. God is not in me or in you or in God's self, but in betweenness. And it is there we find the evidence of God's reality and our own. I think it's just a beautiful sentiment about this idea of intimacy, but also it's about our connection to other people. So that's the other aspect of Judaism. Judaism emphasizes this idea of this intimacy with God, but then also how do we live with other people? Well, part of it is we learn from passionate disagreement, as we talked about with the Talmud. They really bring that. And sometimes, I think in my own experience of the Christian tradition, sometimes we want agreement. We want complete agreement. We don't want to have these disputes. And I think Judaism teaches us we can learn something very valuable from that dispute. And then finally, the idea of social justice, the idea of what tikkun olam, and what I talked about Rabbi Hillel said. And this is a great quote. Famous Jewish rabbi and thinker who died in the 1960s, Abraham Joshua Heschel, wonderful man, very involved in the civil rights movement, in the Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam War movement. This is one of his famous quotes. He said, Jews are called to take a leap of action as opposed to a leap of thought. So in other words, don't just think about doing it, do it. You have to be active in the world. You have to be alleviating suffering. You have to be kind of working for social justice. And I think that's just a beautiful way to think about what Judaism offers to me and kind of challenges me in my own faith commitments. So before I go on to talking about Islam, let me just pause there and see if anyone has any questions or comments that you want to make about what I've talked about so far. And if not, we can come back at the end as well. But if you have anything particularly about Judaism you want to ask or you want to comment on. Oh, go ahead.
I'm curious what the thought is about, Jesus came for the Jews, yet many of them rejected him. How does that play into their history at all?
Yeah, so, it's very interesting. So for Jewish folks, the idea of the Messiah has not yet come yet. And different, so there's many different branches of Judaism. And some branches of Judaism emphasize more this idea of we're waiting for the Messiah. Others don't think of that as important as some branches of Judaism do. But what I would say is that the other thing about Christianity that was a little off-putting, so Christianity, if you go back to the history, originally the early Christians were actually part of the Jewish community. They worshiped in the synagogues along with the Jews, and it was only later that they were expelled from the synagogue. And part of the expulsion from the synagogue was this idea we have, which the idea of the Trinity came later, actually. The idea of the Trinity came around the 300s. It didn't come right after the understanding. There was the understanding that Jesus was somehow connected to God, but in terms of delineating it as the Trinity came much later. But the idea for many Jewish folks was, this doesn't sound like monotheism to me. This sounds like polytheism. If you have this idea of three persons, right? As we talk about in Christianity, we talk about one God, three persons, three manifestations. Doesn't sound very monotheistic from a Jewish perspective. So that was part of it too. It was part of this idea of that doesn't fit with our understanding of the, Judaism was one of the first religions to preach this absolute monotheism. Absolute monotheism. They're surrounded by polytheistic religions in their area, and monotheism was really, really important. So that was part of the reason as well. If that makes sense. Any other questions or comments? Good question. Okay, so we'll go on then to talk a little bit about Islam. Now, the interesting thing about Judaism and Islam is, Jews and Muslims are our closest religious relatives, okay? They're referred to often as the Abrahamic faiths. Have you heard that before? Because all three of our faiths kind of say our origin comes in Abraham, okay? And so there's lots of similarities between these different, traditions. And Islam and Judaism, in some ways, are more similar. It's kind of interesting, with so much conflict in the world, between Jewish folks and Muslim folks. They're actually much more similar to each other than they are even to Christianity. So that's really interesting. Even the languages. So the Hebrew language and the Arabic language are actually both Semitic languages. They come from the same root. In fact, if you hear them, they have very similar sounds to them, and some of the words are very, very similar in them as well. So they're very close to each other in many ways. Okay, so Islam. So the first thing I want to say about Islam, I want to get right at the heart of things. I want to talk about this word jihad, okay? How many of you have heard the word jihad on the news, okay? Or a jihadist, right? You've heard that word before, right? So it's a very misunderstood word and a very misunderstood concept, I think, in the West. And I think the media hasn't helped since 9/11 in terms of how that word has been used, okay? But jihad means this. It literally means struggle, okay? And it's considered to be, it's one, you should struggle to purify oneself to be in concert with the will of Allah, the will of God, okay? The interesting thing about the word Allah, that's another thing important to point out, is Allah is the Arabic word for God. And if you were a Christian who spoke Arabic, you would use the same word Allah. So it's not a different God. It just refers to God, okay? Sometimes people think it's a different God. So jihad is divided into two categories. Okay, there's two kinds of jihad. There's the greater jihad and there's the lesser jihad, okay? And the greater jihad, as it sounds, means this is the most important part of jihad. This is the part you have to pay closest attention to in your sense of being, of engaging in jihad. And there's two kinds of greater jihad. The first is the jihad of the heart, okay? And this is the struggle to do the morally correct thing and to live in concert with the will of Allah. How do I do that personally? How do I personally make sure that I am doing that I'm following God and I'm doing God's will and I'm living in a morally correct way, okay? The other part of the greater jihad is the jihad of the sword. The jihad of the sword is the struggle to discern the correct action in the public sphere. So how do I do the right thing in my society? So it's about, Muslims talk about the greater jihad of the sword as the struggle for social justice. How do we struggle for social justice in our societies? How do we struggle against political and economic injustice? And Muhammad, actually, the founder of Islam, in his society in the Arabian Peninsula where he founded the religion of Islam, he lived in a very classist society where there wasn't a lot of social justice. It was, in fact, the era that he lived in was called the Age of Ignorance because there was so much warring, punishment was brutal, those kinds of things. And when he came to power, he brought a whole different way of being in this. And actually, the first Muslims either came from very aristocratic families or people who were very poor because Islam preached everyone has absolute equality before God. Okay, no one is better or worse. Everyone has absolute equality before God. So it appealed to both kinds of people in this society. And he also was way forward thinking about the role of women, okay, which is something, again, often misperceived, or what is the aspects of people who practice Islam that don't think about women's rights. It's kind of played up in our media. And actually, for the first time, when Muhammad came to power, women had the right to inheritance, they had the right to refusal in marriage, they had the right to own property. That had never happened before. And it was forward-thinking in the rest of the world as well. We're talking about, this would have been I think he was in the 500s and 600s, okay? Think about what the world was like in Europe. It was not, women were still property, okay? This was really innovative. So this idea of the struggle to discern correct action in the public sphere, this idea of social justice is very embedded from the very beginning of Islam. Okay, but we also have to talk about the lesser jihad, but notice it's lesser. And this is, the lesser jihad of the sword is warfare to defend Islam and Islamic lands. this is what is played up, and this is by what very extreme Muslims who call themselves jihadists think they're doing. The issue, though, is that there's very strict prescriptions in the Quran and in something called the Hadith, which is a kind of a companion to the Quran about stories about the life of Muhammad, that about what does it mean to wage war. So very similar. I don't know if any of you have ever in Christianity have heard about the just war theory. There's a just war theory in Christianity that was Augustine and Aquinas kind of came up with these principles about what does it mean to wage a just war. The question is whether modern warfare can ever be just, but that's a whole other question that would take a whole other time to talk about. But the idea here is that there's certain prescriptions about how you wage war, and it has to be defensive war, and it has to be complete immunity, non-combatant immunity. You know, civilians are never involved, and even in the Quran, it even talks about you should not burn trees, you should not destroy land, you have to take care of the land as well, okay? So this, unfortunately, has become what everyone thinks of when they think of the word jihad, but jihad is really a beautiful concept about this idea of how do you personally kind of live correctly and live in a way that's close to God, and how do you do that as a society as well. Here we go. Okay, so this is an interesting graphic. Talks about, what does it mean to do jihad? So it's saying do the right thing. So it has an X on this side. These are the things that are against jihad: terror, murder, assassination, violence. Those all go against jihad. Okay, what is in favor of jihad? Abstinence. So Muslims, people who are strict in their practice of Islam, don't drink alcohol or do any kind of illegal drugs. That's considered a prohibition. No, sexual promiscuity. That's what that one means. You should be engaging in charity. In fact, there's very strict prescriptions on how much you should give in charity. It's very generous about how much you should give. It's called zakat. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, is that you're to give charity. Prayer. I always think about, when I think about my Muslim friends, my Muslim students, I think, they go above and beyond when it comes to prayer than any of us in the Christian tradition. 5 times a day, okay, 5 times a day that they engage in prayer. And then peace, working for peace. In fact, the word Islam is related to, it means submission. You're submitting to the will of Allah, the will of God, but it's related to the word for peace, which is salam or shalom in Hebrew. Like I said, the languages are very similar. So it brings you peace to submit to the will of God, according to Islam. Okay, the next one is the Ummah. Okay, the Ummah literally means the Muslim community, but in Islam, it's thought of that the Muslim community extends to the wider world. Okay, so the whole world is your community. The whole world is a place that you should take responsibility for. It talks about how, the Ummah talks about how community shapes the individual, and the individual has a responsibility for the good of all within that community. Okay, the good of all within that community. And this is very interesting. So historically, there's a period of time in Spain. Actually, it was a long period of time, 900 years in Spain, when the Moors controlled Spain. Okay, the Moors were from North Africa. They were Muslim. They controlled Spain. And in that time period, it was known that the Muslims were in control, but that they had Jews and Christians who were considered to be very high up in the government, okay, very high up. They were given a lot of rights in the government because they were considered to be fellow monotheists. They were fellow monotheists, people who also worship one God. They saw them as kind of brothers and sisters, and so they felt like they should be allowed to be in this community with them. That era is, in Spanish, it's called the convivencia, which means the living together. So it's considered to be a time when Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived together in relative peace. Now, I don't want to overstate it because, it's still this time period when the Muslims are the ruling power. Okay, the Moors were. But still, it was this time of great learning. So during this time period, it's the Dark Ages in the rest of Europe. So a lot of, terrible things going on. Spain was considered to be this time of great learning, lots of translation of different, for example, Greek philosophers. Many of them were translated during this time period because there was a cooperation among these 3 religious traditions. So it was this idea of they were creating an ummah. And I love this quote. This is from the Quran, from the 49th surah or chapter of the Quran. And it says, "We created you from a male and a female, and we made you into people and tribes so that you might come to know each other." So it's kind of saying this idea of pluralism, this idea of being different isn't bad. In fact, God created us all different so that we would come to know one another and kind of benefit from one another. So that's the idea in the Ummah. This idea of diversity is good. Okay, so I want to stop talking for a minute. I want to show you a couple short videos about how Muslims themselves talk about this idea of Ummah, the idea of why should I be working for the good of all in the community, okay? So it's from this website that's called Inspired by Muhammad. It's actually a British website.
It's about always having balance, and I think that's what the Prophet's message, peace be upon him, it was fundamentally about having balance and equilibrium in all that we do. So that was also something which was quite revealing to me when I became a Muslim, is that when we talk about justice, sometimes our sense of justice can lead us to an injustice in the people who become the perpetrators, who were the initial perpetrators of an injustice against us. And the Prophet, peace be upon him's message was always that you repel bad with good, that you always respond to evil with good, that you should always remember that God loves justice and never transgress the limits, so that even when people are committing serious injustices against you, even when the perpetrators may be responsible for heinous crimes, you have a moral responsibility and a moral obligation in front of God to always uphold justice and never yourself transgress those limits. When we look at the Prophet, he wouldn't want to keep even an extra morsel of food in the house out of fear that somebody else might be going without. And that sort of utter devotion to ensuring that nobody was being deprived, that everybody was being cared for, is something that if you do model yourself, as Muslims do, on the Prophet, peace be upon him, you can't possibly be negligent and ignore the real inequalities that continue to be rife in the world around us, whether it be in our community with a small c community, in the bigger sense of society, or in the world at large. And I think that one of the things that certainly has really stayed with me is that being a Muslim is to try and be the voice of the voiceless. Islam's beauty really comes into its own when it becomes manifest, and it becomes manifest when you make it into a tool for the betterment of society, into a tool for the betterment of humankind, and obviously fundamentally even beyond that, a tool for making the world a better place. So the ideal, I think, from an Islamic perspective, is for ethics to become lived ethics, to become an applied body of values, and not remain, unfortunately, as it often is, cloistered in the mosque or somewhere which is somewhat divorced from reality. I think the example of Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Prize winner, who had developed an economic model to get communities out of poverty, is just one example of applied ethics. He took a principle that, people in poverty had just as much right as anybody else to be given the economic means to pull themselves out of poverty. And so he applied a principle of justice, and made it into an economic model. And that's really lived Islam. That's really Islam in action. And when you see Islam in action, when you do see these principles translated into real world actions, then it's not only clear for us as a community to see, it's clear for the world to see. And obviously there's not really a greater recognition than being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. For me as a person, I can't possibly differentiate or distinguish between me and social justice. Social justice is an inherent part of being a Muslim, and therefore it's an inherent part of me as a person.
So I know this was hard because you weren't seeing the person speaking, but was there anything in particular that you heard her say that related to these ideas of the ummah, of kind of taking care of other people? Any lines that stuck out for you as you were listening? Excellent. Yeah. This whole idea, we think about the book of James, where it says, faith without works is dead, right? She's really echoing some of those same ideas. Anything else that you heard that you thought was interesting? I love that in fact, she says, even starting, she says, you repel evil with good. I just love that idea. Isn't that wonderful? You don't repel evil by perpetrating more evil, you repel it by good. If the world really lived that way, what a different place that would be, right? If we did that, yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah. Now, have you heard, she talked at the end about Muhammad Yunus. Have you heard of Muhammad Yunus before? He's a really interesting, he actually spoke at Augsburg about 10 years ago. He's a really great speaker, but he's from Bangladesh, he's a Muslim. He started this thing called the Grameen Bank. The Grameen Bank was the first micro-lending organization. So micro-lending means you give very, very small loans, interest-free loans. That's very important in Islam. Islam believes that you can't charge interest on loans, okay? So you give interest-free loans to people who are very, very poor, and then that helps them to kind of start small businesses and to move themselves out of poverty. So when he started this, he was giving very, very small loans, like we're talking like the equivalent of $20, okay, to women, mostly all women, who were kind of starting these small kind of cottage industries. And he said, I remember in his speech he gave at Augsburg, he said, everyone told me that this is a bad idea. You shouldn't be giving it to women because the men are the ones who are in control, so you really need to give it to the men. And he also said it's a bad idea to not charge interest because that will get them to pay it back. So you're just going to lose all this money. Well, he had like a 98% repayment rate on the loans, okay? And it was a very, very successful. It's since being replicated in a lot of different places around the world because of his thought. And it really was him kind of taking these values from Islam and, as she said, putting it into action, putting it into the world and, putting it into the community. So I think that was a really, really beautiful thing she said. Compassion or mercy, okay? So that's another concept from Islam, very integrated in the whole idea of Islam. So in Islam, there's something called the 99 names for God, okay? And actually it's, I don't know if you've ever seen, in Islam, they have a form of prayer beads that people will kind of like in the Catholic Church, like a rosary, okay? But it's something, and actually I've read that some people think the rosary came from Christianity's encounter with Islam, and then they got this idea, we're going to create a kind of prayer bead as well. And when you say this, you say these 99 names for God as you're doing this prayer bead to remind you of who God is. And there's two different kinds of names for God. There's the names of majesty, and there's the names of beauty. Okay, and the names of majesty are considered to be masculine names, the names of beauty are considered to be feminine names, because Islam does not think God has a gender, but that God is beyond that, but they want to have both those kinds of adjectives. And two of the names are names about compassion and mercy, and they're kind of the two very first names of these 99 names. And here's what they are. They are Ar-Rahim, which means mercy-giving, and Ar-Rahman, which means all-merciful. It translates also to compassion, and it comes from the root word is rahem, which means womb, okay? So what it's saying is to be compassionate is to be like a womb, to be nourishing, comforting, encompassing, okay? So it's really interesting. That's a beautiful way to think about it, that just like a mother nourishes a child in a womb, that's how we should give compassion for someone, as we're doing that kind of total kind of enveloping them in this way. So this is what God is. God is this kind of being in the Islamic understanding. And another thing that Islam says is it says that compassion or mercy is the stamp of creation. So it's compassion or mercy is stamped on creation, and it is the ontological thread that runs through everything. So I had to throw in a big word for you so you'd know that I was a professor. So the word ontology comes from philosophy, and it's the study of being. Okay, so it's saying that it is the state of being of the whole world. Is this idea of creation. Creation is compassion is the state of being in all of the world. And there's an idea within Islam, a very interesting idea about we have to have mercy to the created world. Okay, eco-Islam, they would call it. So we have to really think about how are we treating the creator. Remember when I was talking about jihad, I was saying you have to be careful not to burn down trees when you're waging war. You know, that's really important. There's lots of ideas in Islam about how are we supposed to treat the created world. I have another video. Do I chance it and play it for you? Let's see. I'll just play the audio again. I won't touch the PowerPoint. But this is another one from the same website of someone talking about this idea about how he understands this.
Well, Islamic civilization has always been based on the rejection of waste as an underestimation of God's blessings. So in the construction of the new mosque here in Cambridge, for instance, we are very much at the forefront of the local sort of environmental movement in that we are using the latest heat pumps, conservation technology, a sedum green roof of the building so that we'll have an almost zero carbon footprint. That's the intention of creating one of Europe's first sort of truly ecologically responsible mosques. So that's an example of how the community is getting together to lead the way, an often recalcitrant outside community that often doesn't sufficiently understand environmental issues, to show that a sacred vision of human beings and a real reverence for the sanctity of nature has to represent itself in the place where nature meets humanity and humanity meets God, which is the place of worship, where heaven meets earth and everything is reconciled. So our place of worship here in Cambridge is necessarily a showcase, not just of the beauties of Islamic art and architecture, which has always integrated natural motifs, vegetal motifs, arabesques, geometrical principles and so forth, but also, and more significantly I think, the need to act as custodians in creation when so much of the secular world seems to be indifferent to anything other than a dog-eat-dog competitive understanding of how the economy should be and how we should engage with nature. The act of worship in Islam is precisely that reconnection of human beings to the sanctity of the earth. We begin in a standing position and we end in a position of prostration. Our foreheads, the symbol of our human pride, pressed to the earth, the clay from which we originated. Adam in the Quranic vision is created out of clay, out of earth. In our basic physicality, we are just another part of the physical world. But what makes us unusual is that we have this capacity to subvert the physical world far more than any other species possibly can, but we also have the capacity to make reparation and to uphold the physical world as well. So the basic Islamic understanding of the environment is not that it's a backdrop to the real drama which is human beings, but that we are part of this extraordinary cosmic symphony which is the interaction of the divine names of which we are a part. The only thing that differentiates us from the environment is that we have this custodial capacity. We can rise above our impulses, which tend to be rapacious, and turn it into the garden which it originally was, and which is a manifestation or a reminder of Eden and an anticipation of the paradise which is to come. Or we can turn it into a kind of hell, the fiery principle as opposed to the watery principle. The fiery principle is that of anger, greed, envy, uproar, those possibilities in the human soul. So just as in the Islamic imagination we come from a garden and at the end of time there will be a garden or there will be fire, similarly, what we do in our own souls to produce a garden in the soul or a fire of greed in the soul is going to have a knock-on effect because we are custodians in other aspects of creation. So we can turn the world into something that becomes hotter, more greedy, more competitive, more destructive, or we can turn the world into something that is calm, that is garden-like and reflects the divine purposes. For me, the genius of the prophetic teaching is that he was somebody who calls us back to what we are as natural human beings, not as fallen, not as intrinsically sinful, not as godlike beings temporarily visiting this ugly and fallen world, but as part of this extraordinary panoply of the interaction of divine names and predicates, which is the created world.
Okay, so anything in particular you heard here that you thought was interesting? or you have questions about? So it's very interesting in the Quran. Adam in the second surah of the Quran, the second chapter of the Quran, Adam is named by God as his Khalifa, is the word in Arabic, and it means his vice regent. So he's God's vice regent. He's supposed to be the one who is going to be caring for the earth because God can't be there to care for it in the same way. So that's Adam's role. So that becomes the human's role, is to do that, is to be the vice regent on earth. And they're really echoing a lot of those principles here as we talk about this. Okay. Okay, now that's not part's not working. I think Carol left. I'm not sure what I have to do do that. Oh, here she is. You did it right then, if you can remember what you did. Maybe if you go to PowerPoint there, I wonder if that will do it.
Yep.
There we go, yeah.
Right here, right there.
Yep, there. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, now let's see if it works. Okay, so, also let me try it from here. Did it work? No? Okay, there we go. Okay, so then how has Islam enriched my faith? So I think, first of all, this whole idea about jihad to me gets at this whole idea from, we talk about in the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the pure in heart. You know, this whole idea about the desire to live a faithful life, I think that is really clear in Islam, the desire to live a faithful heart, the desire to be in concert with the will of God. Then this whole idea of solidarity, the value for the diversity of the human family. How do we think of ourselves as one human family, okay, and not divided into all these groups? And then I think, again, this last piece that I talked about compassion towards the natural world, this idea of stewardship of the natural world, that just seems like another really important idea that's very profoundly emphasized in Islam as well. Okay, so questions. What questions or comments do you have about this part on Islam, or if anything that now comes to mind when we talked about Judaism? Yes?
I have one. What is the time frame for Islam as compared to Christianity?
So Islam is starts in the 500s, 600s. Okay, so it's 600 years, 500, 600 years after the birth of Jesus. So it comes later in that time period. So it's the newest of the three religions. Yeah. Yes.
What was Muhammad's religious background?
So during the time of Muhammad's life, there were all these different tribes in Arabia at the time, and they were polytheistic. Each tribe had their own god, and they were always fighting with each other. You know, it was, like I said, it was the age of ignorance. Lots of conflict around these gods, and which god was the supreme god, and that kind of a thing among these different groups. So that's how he was raised. But what happened was Muhammad would do these meditative retreats where he'd go up to this cave above Mecca called Hijra. He'd go up to this cave, and on one occasion, when he was in the cave, he had this experience of being embraced by some spirit and was almost crushed by a spirit. And the spirit said to him, read. And he said, I can't read, because he was illiterate. And he said, the spirit kept saying, read. And he said, I can't read, you know. And then finally, the third time, he said, read. And Muhammad said, what shall I read? And what happens is then, the belief among Muslims is that the Quran then was dictated to him by the angel Gabriel. That eventually was written down over a series of many years, but that was the beginning of the Quran being dictated to him. So that's kind of the story of kind of the origin story of Muhammad. And he had a very difficult life, actually. So he was, his father died before he was born. His mother died when he was 6 years old, so he ended up in the care of his grandfather. When he was 8, his grandfather died. He ended up in the care of his uncle. You know, so really difficult childhood. Even though he came from this prominent family, he was very poor because of this, because of kind of the circumstances of his life. And he was known for being someone who was considered to be he was a trader, was considered to be very honest, very truthful. You could trust him. So that was kind of his personality. And this is from other records, historical records besides the Quran. It's been documented about the life of Muhammad. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Do the extremists get their justification from the Quran?
Well, it's kind of like the cherry picking Because certainly, just like in the Bible, you can think about, there's very harsh sections of the Bible, right? Where the evildoers are going to get their comeuppance kind of idea. Well, there's the same kind of thing in the Quran. There's certain portions of the Quran. You got to think about the era in which these scriptures were written. Again, era of very much harsh living, right? And so certainly you can cherry pick parts of the Quran that are very harsh in how they talk about the treatment of unbelievers. It doesn't define who an unbeliever is, but it talks about the treatment of unbelievers and that kind of a thing. So they're putting a certain lens on the Quran and kind of taking the pieces that they think kind of fit their vision. It's really interesting, though, because any of the kind of ways in which violence is perpetrated, it really is hard to justify that when you look at the Quran. I mean, really, when you look at the really strict ideas about what constitutes warfare, it's really clear about what constitutes warfare. And a lot of, even when we think about, the most recent Hamas attack, that would be completely outside what the Quran would say would be a justified use of war. That makes sense. You could say they were defending Islamic land, but the idea of non-combatant immunity is really clear. That shouldn't have happened. Good question. Any other questions? Yes?
On a related note, maybe it's because of the way the media treats it, but we don't hear Muslims who are more mainstream speaking out against the extremists. Are there people that do that and we just don't hear it, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think. Well, first of all, so now we're getting into the weeds, but it's interesting, the weeds here. So there's actually, so you've heard the term Sharia, right? If you've heard that term before, Sharia actually just means Islamic law, and it's very similar to the Torah, where you have Jewish law. Sharia is about how you're supposed to live as a Muslim, okay? Just like the Torah is about how you're supposed to live as a Jew. Well, there's actually 4 different schools of Sharia, and they tend to be concentrated in certain parts of the world. And they can have pretty different interpretations of how you think about that. So you can have very conservative school over here and a school that's much more liberal over here. So there's actually a lot of diversity in thinking around how these things are practiced. Okay, so and I think if you are in the Muslim world, you might hear some of these differences, and I think you're right. We don't get a very accurate view of that here. I don't think we get much about that. You really have to search. It's not even like it's easily accessible. I think you really have to search for different ideas about this. Yeah. Good question. Any other questions? I don't want to keep you too long to get to, for those you have to get to church, but other questions that you might have? We can always, if you have more questions, bring them next time, okay? And we'll start with questions next time if it's percolating and you have more you're thinking about and you want to talk about it. And next time we'll also talk about Hinduism and Buddhism and kind of like where do we go from here, okay? What does this all mean, from here, okay? Thank you. Thanks so much.